Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty out there. It's this article called Have We Ran Out of Souls by the Appalachian Gorilla. And, well, the title kind of says it all, right? Like, is it possible that some people are just born without a soul? And if so, why?
It's definitely a question that kind of stops you in your tracks, huh? It makes you think about like what makes us human,
Yeah.
what drives us, why we connect with certain things, even just like the whole idea of having an inner life.
Yeah, for sure. And the thing is, the author doesn't just throw this idea out there and leave it at that. He goes deep, sharing personal stories and how different religions and philosophies have seen the soul. Then he gets into his own pretty unique theories about it all. And he even brings in thoughts from his partner, G3N3R, and someone named Brankbeer.
So basically, we're here to unpack all of this. We're going to look at why he thinks some people might not have a soul, and then like what does that even mean?
Yeah.
What are the implications? But before we get into all that, it's important for you listening to know that we're not saying we agree with every single thing the author says. We're just trying to understand where he's coming from, exploring these ideas.
Right, right. So to kick things off, the author starts with this scene that I think a lot of people can relate to. He's back working in a warehouse, something he's done before. He's this quality control guy, and he's got a team, including this one forklift driver.
And that forklift driver, well, he's kind of the catalyst for this whole soulless idea for the author. And all starts with something as simple as talking about food.
Exactly. So the author and his assistant are there, and they're talking about their favorite foods, getting into recipes. One of them's talking about Italian dishes. The other one loves Puerto Rican food. And then they ask the forklift driver, "What about you? What do you like to cook?" And he just says, "Macaroni and cheese."
Seems basic enough, right? But it's what happens next that really throws the author for a loop. He asks the driver, okay, so what about pork chops? How do you make yours? And the answer is like unbelievably simple. Just straight from the freezer into the oven. No spices. Nothing. And bam, that's the moment. The author's like, that's it. I figured it out. Some men are born without souls. It's kind of a wild conclusion to jump to based on, well, someone's lack of culinary enthusiasm, I guess you could say.
I think it shows how much our own passions and interests mean to us, and how we sometimes assume everyone else feels the same way. It makes you wonder, like the author does, have you ever met someone who just didn't seem to care about something that's important to you? And it made you question what's going on inside them, what makes them tick.
It's a really interesting way to start thinking about this whole question of what makes us who we are. But okay, so the story's got us thinking. But what exactly is a soul? The article then goes into this whole breakdown of how different groups have defined it throughout history. Right, it's like a crash course in soul concepts from different traditions. So first up, we've got the Abrahamic religions. They tend to see the soul as a divine spark, something God gives you at creation. It's interesting, later on, the author actually seems to kind of push back on this idea based on what he's observed himself.
Then there's Hinduism, where the soul is like this little piece of a much bigger cosmic consciousness. And the author points out that in this framework, it makes sense that some people might not be connected to it in the same way.
And of course, we've got to talk about the philosophers. They've got all sorts of ideas about the soul. Some see it as consciousness itself, others as a separate entity that exists apart from our physical bodies. The author does make this interesting point about how philosophers before the internet, they had a much more limited view of humanity, right? Compared to what we have now with this global interconnectedness.
What about science? They have a perspective too, right? The article mentions how science often explains our sense of self as just how the brain works. But the author argues that this doesn't explain everything. He brings up the qualia of beauty, that feeling of awe and wonder you get from something beautiful. He doesn't think science can fully explain that subjective experience.
And then he starts to bring in other voices to add to the conversation. His partner, G3N3R, has this very straightforward definition. He says, a soul is the ability to feel quality. And the author, at first he defines it as the ability to create a beautiful transaction.
We also get this really out there definition from someone named Branker. He talks about the soul as a unified crystallization of extropy and matter being an entropic matrix of potentiality, always trying to become more organized and perfect. It's almost like this cosmic, energetic definition.
It's kind of amazing to see all these different takes on the soul side by side. You've got spiritual and philosophical ideas, personal ones, even hints of scientific thought. It just shows you how hard it is to define something like the soul.
But the author doesn't just leave it at that. His own understanding of the soul actually changes as the article goes on. Later on, he focuses on this idea of inheritance.
Yeah, he starts to believe that the soul is passed down through generations. tied to your family, culture, the land where your people come from. It's not something you're taught, but something deeper, almost like it's part of your DNA.
He even says that this connection can skip generations, so you might feel drawn to people you've never met just because you share this ancestral link. It makes you wonder, have you ever felt a strong connection to a place or culture that you don't have any obvious ties to? Maybe that's your inherited soul speaking to you.
That idea of a soul being linked to your family and where you come from
Hmm.
is really different from those more universal definitions we talked about before. It brings in this sense of shared identity and like a connection to the past.
So then the article gets to the big question, why does the author think we might be running out of souls? And this is where things get really interesting.
He's got this pretty dramatic hypothesis. He thinks the huge increase in the human population has messed with the natural recycling of souls.
He believes that souls belong to families and groups of people, not in a heaven or hell way, but that they come back to be reborn into the same lineage. But now, with billions of people on Earth, he thinks the system is overloaded, like nature can't keep up.
And then he ties this to all the advancements we've made, like medicine now helps people survive who might not have in the past.
Mm.
And the way our economy works, it lets people who the author might consider soulless have kids. And his argument is that soulless parents create soulless children, which dilutes the whole soul pool, so to speak.
That's a pretty bold statement. But then he throws in this other idea. Difficult environments, places with lots of hardship, they can actually push souls to show their light. That's how he explains why some of the most amazing art and food comes from places that have struggled. It's like going through tough times can refine the soul, show what it's made of.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex argument. He's connecting population growth, societal changes, even the environment, to the presence or absence of souls.
Okay, so let's say we entertain this idea for a second. How would we even know if someone doesn't have a soul? The article goes back to those definitions from G3 and 3 Rull and the author.
Right. Remember G3 and 3 Thrill's definition, the ability to feel quality. That becomes a key indicator. The author gives this example. Think about the difference between a home-cooked meal made with love by your grandma versus just grabbing something processed from the store. It's about being able to appreciate those things that have care and effort put into them.
He uses this great example of French toast. You could just fry an egg, which gets the job done. But if you take the time to make French toast, adding milk, vanilla, cinnamon to the eggs, soaking the bread, frying it in butter, then putting powdered sugar and fresh berries on top, that's creating an experience. A memory, he calls it. It shows care and attention to detail, something a soulless person might not get or care about as much. It's about going beyond just the basic function of food.
And that ties into the author's beautiful transaction idea. It's about giving and receiving, investing in relationships, like parents taking care of their kids, knowing that someday those kids will probably take care of them. He thinks a soulless person wouldn't be as invested in those deep connections.
He even lists out some traits he associates with people who do have souls. They're naturally loving and pay attention to details. They get lost in wonder easily. They might have weird schedules and struggle with how structured modern life is. They feel emotions deeply. They hate mass consumerism, and they love to explore and wander.
He even brings in some historical perspective, mentioning Machiavelli, who said only about 1 in 100 people have a really strong spirit. And then Mountain chimes in, saying with the population boom, those odds have probably gotten even worse. So this idea that people have different levels of inner depth isn't exactly new.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? As you're listening, do any of these descriptions sound like people you know? Or maybe even parts of yourself? It's not about judging anyone, but just thinking about these different ways of seeing human nature.
And we have to say this again, just like at the beginning, these are just one author's observations and theories from this one article. It's not like some universal truth or anything. Defining the soul is something people have been debating forever, and it's subjective. We can't scientifically prove or disprove whether someone has one.
Totally agree. We're just trying to understand what the author is saying in the Appalachian Guerrilla, not tell you what to believe or endorse any political ideas that might come up when you talk about culture, family, or society.
It's also worth pointing out that the author ends the article with a little bit of self-awareness. He says he's just another smart monkey banging my fingers on a keyboard made by a slave in China. It kind of brings things back down to earth and reminds us that this is all speculation.
So let's recap. We've done a deep dive into this wild idea from the Appalachian Guerrilla that maybe we've run out of souls, or at least some people are born without them. We looked at how the author came to this idea, all the different ways he defines soul, his theory about how population growth affects souls, and even what traits he thinks show whether someone has a soul or not.
It definitely challenges the way we usually think about what it means to be human and have consciousness. It gives us this new kind of unsettling way to see why people experience and interact with the world in such different ways.
And that brings us to our final thought for you, our listeners. Now that you've heard all this, what does soul mean to you? And how does this perspective, even if it's unconventional, change how you see human behavior and our connections with each other? We want you to think about your own experiences and what you've observed, keeping in mind everything we talked about today.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.